Well, welcome everybody to this Scottish Cancer Foundation lecture. My name is Bob Steele and I am currently the chair of the board of directors of the Scottish Cancer Foundation. Now, before we do anything, I need to tell you that there are no fire alarms that are planned, no fire alarm testing planned today. So if the fire alarm goes off, the best thing to do is to go out the way you came in. If that, for any reason, is not possible, there's another fire exit over there. So in the unlikely event that fire breaks out, you know what to do. And when you go outside, the staff will direct you to the dome, which is where we have to gather while the fire's put out. Now, before we come to the main event, I would like to say a few words about the Scottish Cancer Foundation. It was founded back in 1998, I think it was, quite a few years ago now, by John Evans and Pat Forrest, two very distinguished scientists. Pat Forrest was the professor of clinical surgery at the University of Edinburgh and started breast cancer screening. And their vision was to have a charity that was specifically dedicated to improving outcomes for cancer in Scotland. And recently we have focused very much on cancer prevention because this is a very underfunded area in terms of research particularly. And we are dedicated to this area. And if you wish to contribute, obviously we would be very happy, and we've left some leaflets outside for you to have a look at. The lecture we have been running in conjunction with the Royal Society of Edinburgh for quite a number of years, and I will be introducing the speaker to you in just a moment. But before we do that, I have a particularly pleasant task to do, because every year we award a prize for the most outstanding work in cancer prevention in Scotland. And this year, the medal goes to, the medal and prize goes to Stephen McSorley, who's from the University of Glasgow, surgeon, University of Glasgow, who has been working on colorectal polyps. So colorectal polyps are a precancerous growth in the large bowel, and understanding how they grow, how they progress is extremely important in the field of cancer prevention. So we had quite a number of applications. I think there were about 8 applications in all. And the committee were unanimous in their decision that this work that Stephen has been doing has been really outstanding. So I'd like to invite Stephen to come up so that we can present him with the prize. So there are 2 prizes. You get the Forrest Evans Medal, and there's a cash prize to help you with your work. So very well done, Stephen. I don't know if you want to say anything, but...
Well, just to thank you and the foundation for the recognition. It means a lot, especially at that kind of early to mid-career stage, to have your work recognised, and it's a real catapult moving forward for something that's really important, I think.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Very well
Thank
you. Now, my equally pleasant task now is to introduce our lecturer. So today's lecturer is a good friend and colleague of mine. We've worked together for a long time, haven't we, Mark? So Mark Hull from the University of Leeds is a gastroenterologist, and he too has focused quite a bit on colorectal polyps. Now, his interest over the years has been looking at how drugs and how dietary supplements may modify the growth of polyps and therefore modify the risk of cancer. And we are very much looking forward to his talk. It's been a great privilege to work with Mark over the years because he is very insightful. He's always explained his work very clearly to me, and I'm sure he will do the same to you. And his trials have been absolutely models of how a trial should be organised and run. And he has produced some very interesting, significant results. And for me, it's been a privilege to be involved with them. So Mark, can I invite you to give your lecture on dietary supplements and cancer? And thank you very much for coming up to a cold Edinburgh to speak to us.
Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for battling through the wintry conditions, and welcome to those people listening in on the live stream. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here in these historic surroundings. Oh, and can I add my congratulations to the Scottish football team? Great news north of the border. So I know what you're thinking. Am I in the right lecture here looking at that slide? But I thought I'd start with some audience participation here. Have a look at that. I'll keep those pictures on the screen as I go through the first 4 or 5 slides. And then about 8 slides in, we'll just run through the answers and we'll see how successful everyone's been. So this is what I'm going to be talking about for the next 45, 50 minutes. I'm really going to be discussing, I think, the complex, conflicting, so I would say confusing relationship between dietary supplement, health supplement use, and cancer risk reduction, cancer prevention. So I'll start by talking about how we define what is a dietary supplement, go through some information that we've got about who's using them and why, before then talking about cancer prevention guidelines, recommendations in general. I'm then going to drill down to the data, some of the evidence about dietary supplements, both possible benefits and harms that supplements might have in a cancer prevention setting, and then look forwards towards a time when we might be using a personalized approach on an individual population level to try and make best use of dietary substances with a look into the future. So the Food Standards Agency in the UK and the Federal Drug Administration in the States define a dietary or health supplement as something that's used orally, is definitely a dietary ingredient, but is concentrated and is presented in a dose form. And you'll all be aware that there can be a whole variety of those: vitamins, minerals, trace elements, botanicals, moving into the sports nutrition field slightly, amino acids, etc., even extending to live substances, live microbials, probiotics, enzymes, etc., and an equally large number of different formulations, whether that be tablets, capsules, even gummies, and powders, and food forms, teas and bars. So a huge number of different formulations. But the thing they all have in common is that they are labelled as a dietary supplement. And I think this is remarkable. It's estimated online that there might be as many as 50,000 different supplement products available somewhere in the States, probably similar here now with the advent of online sales. And the market intelligence agencies in the UK estimate that the UK market size for dietary supplements is in and around £3 billion a year. Actually, that next statistic there was surprising to me. I mean, according to which the actual balance of sales for health supplements is actually still in favour of high street sales, 2/3 to 1/3 online. And I've got some evidence of that, which was collected by my wife as recently as last week in the aisles of Costco in Leeds. So as far as the eye can see there are shelves of health supplements. It sort of makes you believe that some of those financial predictions are probably somewhere near the mark. So let me quite early on try and make a distinction between a dietary supplement and a medicine. Some would call it a nutraceutical. I quite like the term nutraceutical. It says something about using a nutrient in a pharmaceutically packaged form. And that's got something to do with a difference in dose, in purity and quality, and also this key aspect of labeling. And I just put up 3 examples early on just to explain that several of these agents actually cross that boundary and sit in the middle there, straddling those 2 different definitions. And here there are 3 examples there: folic acid, calcium with or without vitamin D, and also something, a class of substances I'm very interested in, which I'll talk about later, which are the omega-3 fatty acids. And I've used omega-3 fatty acids just below there to just explain something or provide a contrast for the dose and purity of omega-3 fatty acids if you get them in dietary form versus a supplement form versus a prescription licensed medicine. So there you'll see that a pretty small adult portion of salmon will contain 400 milligrams of the 2 main omega-3 fatty acids, EPA and DHA combined. You don't get much more from taking 1 or 2 fish oil capsules, the sort of thing you'd get from a high street supplement store, where the oil in that capsule is only 20% EPA, DHA, and full of lots of other impure fatty acids. So you'd get about 200 milligrams a day from 1 high street supplement capsule. And contrast that with the prescription EPA formulation that's licensed in the UK for prevention of heart attacks and strokes, where individuals taking 4 capsules a day can receive 4,000 milligrams of EPA, so an order of magnitude more EPA for that licensed indication than you would get in a dietary form. But I think it's the labeling that's really critical here to the distinction between dietary supplements and medicines. So dietary supplements are classified as food, certainly in the UK. And I think most people will recognize that food labeling regulations are not as robust as those for medicines. So one way of putting it is that dietary supplements are considered safe until proven unsafe, the exact opposite of the way that new medicines, new drugs would be handled. And I think remarkably, the Federal Drug Administration in the States can only intervene with a dietary supplement once that product has come to market, not before. I think that's remarkable still. But it still remains illegal to make a claim for a dietary supplement about disease prevention, diagnosis, or treatment. But dietary supplements the labels can make a health claim. So you might have seen these sorts of statements on bottles somewhere along the line that a particular dietary supplement supports gut health, good for maintenance of bones, maintaining memory, brain function, etc. But I think you can quite easily see that health claims can start to become misleading in terms of any disease claim. And some would argue that they are deliberately vague. And I just show you one example from 2012 this was, where Bayer, the German pharmaceutical giant who makes quite a popular brand of dietary supplement called Centrum, was actually threatened with a lawsuit by the non-profit Centre for Science in the Public Interest, which I put down at the bottom right there, saying that their claim for heart health and colon health at the bottom of that label had no evidence backing it up. And Bayer dropped that label as a consequence. And I think a lot of that goes on, and there is a blurring between disease and health claims, which is not helpful. We can maybe touch on that in the Q&A afterwards. So who's taking multivitamins, dietary supplements? There is no good science, as far as I'm aware, around this. So I've had to resort to YouGov polls and which surveys here to give you a feel for this. So I put the Scottish data up here to so you can compare with the rest of the UK. On the left is the results of a 6-monthly survey from YouGov, where that question in the title is posed. You'll see that Scots seem to be slightly less likely to take a health supplement. Maybe their use is a bit more labile. I'm not quite sure why the Scottish lines aren't as straight, but that pink line there is the percentage number of people taking a regular or reporting that they take a regular multivitamin or dietary supplement. And that's running in the region of 40 to 50% of those respondents. And then look at the data on the right-hand side from the Which survey of about 2,500 adults, 3/4 of whom are taking a supplement. 2/3 of the people taking a supplement are using them on a daily basis, basically. And 15% of individuals take as many as 4 supplements per day. But those people are really sort of confused about why they're taking them when asked. So half those respondents said they found supplement information confusing. I'm not surprised with that issue about disease versus health claim. And perhaps only 1/3 actually bothered to read the label information. And only a third consulted a healthcare professional about any of this. So really some confusion out there about, on an individual level, why people are taking supplements. And that poses the question, well, why are people taking dietary supplements? A lot of them don't know. Again, the science behind this is really low quality. It's not well understood at all. And I think the safe summary is that reasons are definitely many and varied. Of course, and I really want to emphasize this, that there are specific medical situations where dietary supplements are important and are valid, including preconception and pregnancy for folic acid, for example. But the vast majority are still related to this idea of overall health improvement, wellness, giving more energy, reducing fatigue, etc. Often in surveys, this idea of this vague concept of immune support comes out. In fact, there was a survey from the ODS, the Office for Dietary Supplements in the States, National Institute of Health, where immune support seemed to be the commonest reason that people gave for using supplements. And that same survey, though, basically reported that up to 1/5 of people who were taking supplement actually thought that there was a role for disease prevention, including cancer. The one bit of data that I could find in a peer-reviewed scientific journal, a study from UCL, was that in just over 1,000 individuals who'd already had cancer, were living with and beyond cancer, believed that the supplements that they were taking, that's 19% of them, actually could prevent cancer returning. So I think the bottom line is that there's a huge amount of confusion, misinformation, particularly from labeling, that's driving supplement use. So let's go back to the quiz questions at the start now, before I start to talk about cancer prevention guidelines and how dietary supplement use sort of fits into that. So that top left picture, I've cheated a little bit here. This is willow salix alba. I put this up because many people know, lots of nods around the room, that particularly the bark is a rich source of salicylic acid. You can actually get salicylic acid as an oral supplement. but it's usually used in a topical form. And I put this up here just to remind everyone, if they didn't already know, that aspirin is actually a simple chemical modification of natural salicylic acid. And I've also been a bit naughty with the top right picture, because if I'd shown you the rhizome of this plant, more of you might have got this. So this is turmeric, this is curcuma longa, a rich source of curcumin, a polyphenol antioxidant, prized by many societies for its anti-inflammatory activity. And then the dead easy one on the bottom left, got red grapes there, haven't we? That's Vitis vinifera. And that's the skins of red grapes are rich in another polyphenol called resveratrol. Resveratrol is actually one of the interventions in a current Cancer Research UK polyp prevention trial that's a bowel cancer prevention trial, which is active in the UK at the moment. And then finally, the bottom right picture is berberis. Now, berberin, if you look at berberin online and also in health food shops, there are a lot of products containing berberin, and I cannot find one scrap of evidence that it has any beneficial biological activity. So, moving on. Let's now look at cancer prevention recommendations in general and how dietary supplements fit in. And I'm going to start with the recommendations from the World Cancer Research Fund. Highly regarded organization that have done a huge amount over several decades now to bring together lots of evidence about factors that increase and decrease cancer risk, with a focus, I might add, on weight, physical activity, and diet, as opposed to smoking cessation and safe sun exposure, etc. So you'll see the first 6 recommendations going clockwise left to right all address this quite complicated relationship between weight, calorie intake, and physical activity. And of course, there are several of these recommendations talk about diet quality, particularly limiting consumption of red and processed meat, which is important, we think is important for bowel cancer and stomach cancer risk, but also mention of healthy balanced diet in terms of whole grains, vegetables, etc. This is important because we now think that at least 13 cancers are linked to excess body weight, including bowel cancer, postmenopausal breast cancer, kidney cancer. 13 cancers thought to be linked to excess body weight. And then recommendation number 7 is limiting alcohol consumption. Again, not part of my talk today, but important just to flag that it's alcohol consumption, even in moderation, is thought to be associated with risk of seven different cancers: liver, esophagus, head and neck cancers, but also bowel cancer as well. And a point that I made just at the start when I showed this infographic was that, because you probably can't read the small text in the middle of that infographic circle, but World Cancer Research Fund mentioned there, and clearly this is hugely important, that smoking cessation and staying safe in the sun are hugely important recommendations. But look at this 8th infographic here. So that says, do not use supplements for cancer prevention. A definite negative there, a clear steer to not use supplements. And here's my second example of cancer prevention guidelines. These are the Scottish Cancer Foundation guidelines. So similar infographic. In fact, there are 12 recommendations here rather than the 10 from WCRF. And the two extras here are about avoidance of salty food, avoidance of salt, moderation in salt intake, particularly important for stomach cancer risk, and perhaps relevant to the Scottish audience for these top tips is the purple one at the bottom, which is the staying safe in the sun. But exactly the same message from the Scottish Cancer Foundation about supplement use. Do not use supplements to protect against cancer. Instead, choose a balanced diet. So, similar recommendations from many other sources, including Macmillan, NHS sources, etc. So I'm just going to drill down now into some of the evidence behind that recommendation on those infographics. And I've taken the text here from the WCRF and also this time from Cancer Research UK. So that first point from the WCRF is all about eating a healthy, balanced diet. But I just highlight now these two next statements. So the second one is starting to say something else. It's saying some supplements are actually in doses that far exceed what you would likely to eat in food. And there is some evidence that high-dose supplements may actually be harmful. So it's starting to talk about harm in those in that text. And a similar situation with the Cancer Research UK guidance. It's saying something about the fact that there's no reliable evidence for supplement and multivitamin use reducing risk of cancer. But it's even more definitive in its statement about possible harm. Here it's talking about a particular supplement called beta-carotene, which I'll come on to in a minute, that may increase the risk of lung cancer in people who smoke. Very specific statement, before then talking again about the healthy, balanced diet. So what I'm going to do now is just go even further into the evidence behind those two statements. The first one, that there's no reliable evidence that supplements are beneficial. And secondly, to look at the evidence about whether some supplements could be actually harmful. So this first statement about there being no reliable evidence that supplements reduce the risk of cancer is these days really based on the most up-to-date, comprehensive review, systematic review by a US task force, where they pull together all the available evidence, really well done, what we call systematic review of 84 studies. And the summary in the editorials and the press, etc., that came out from this is that there was no benefit for reducing either mortality, heart disease, or cancer. But in fact, the strict scientific summary of it is really that there's insufficient evidence to work out what the balance of benefit and harm might be, primarily because even though there have been 84 studies, they've all by and large studied different preparations, different multivitamin preparations in different sorts of people. So bringing all that data together and making a firm conclusion is not possible. So really the state of play is that we haven't got the evidence that they work. So now let's look at this question of harm. So they're the two statements again. High-dose supplements could actually be harmful. And then that second, more specific one, high doses of this thing called beta-carotene might actually increase the risk of lung cancer in smokers. Beta-carotene, by the way, the red-orange pigment that's in high quantities in carrots, sweet potatoes, etc. It's a precursor, a provitamin of vitamin A. And throughout the 70s and 80s, huge amount of evidence that individuals with low levels of beta-carotene in the blood actually had an increased risk of cancer. And this had got to the stage where there was a review in Nature, highly esteemed scientific publication. This is in 1981. And the authors of that review, it's like a who's who of the epidemiological greats. That's Richard Peto, Richard Doll, Michael Sporn, all extolling the virtues of beta-carotene and producing an in-depth review of the evidence that low levels of beta-carotene equals increased risk of many cancers. And I don't think you can read that bottom statement, but this made me chuckle. You do not get this in scientific publications in this day and age. So this is the editor of Nature saying, I'll read it out. Unwary readers, if such there are, of Nature, probably, I'm not sure, should not take the accompanying article as a sign that the consumption of large quantities of carrots is necessarily protective against cancer, and that the correlation between blood retinol, so that's the product of beta-carotene, and cancer avoidance is for the time being sub judice. So that's a central tenet, really, of the epidemiological scientists saying, yes, you can have a whole bunch of observational evidence, but just be really, really careful about whether you start to draw any causal conclusion or relationship between those. I'm pretty sure that you don't get editorial statements like that with articles these days. So that evidence that was in that review led to intervention trials, to clinical trials where individuals were given beta-carotene, and in this particular example with vitamin E. The rather boringly named ATBC trial, alpha tocopherol beta-carotene trial. Let me explain. So when I write randomized double-blind for a trial, what I mean is that those 29,000 men who were smoking were randomly assigned to one of those four treatments: vitamin E, beta-carotene on its own, both, or neither, by computer, randomly assigned. And the trial was performed in a double-blind manner. So that means that the participants didn't know what they were taking, and the researchers didn't know. And I'll come back. Most of the trials I'll talk about from now on in will be randomized double-blind trials. And the trial was designed to monitor for lung cancer and other cancers as a sort of secondary outcome over a period of 5 to 8 years. Now, just to let you know that big trials like this always have what's called an oversight committee, independent individuals who can look at the results of the trial as it's going on, unblinded, so that they can check that there's no harm being done, or there isn't enormous benefit to being in one of those arms that would mean it become unethical to continue the trial. So this ATBC trial did have a data monitoring committee, and after 4 years, it said, stop, we've seen something in the data here that we're concerned about. I think you need to stop your trial. Because when they looked at the data about vitamin E, comparing people who were taking vitamin E against a dummy, a placebo, they saw no change in cancer incidence. But when they looked at the beta-carotene, people taking beta-carotene versus the dummy, then they saw that those people who were taking beta-carotene, those men who were taking beta-carotene, had more lung cancers. And I put the graphs from the original paper on the right-hand side there. And you can see that the line here, which shows the increase in lung cancer in people taking beta-carotene, is splitting away and increasing faster than those individuals who were randomly allocated to placebo. And in fact, the number of deaths in the men who were taking beta-carotene was increased for all causes, including cardiovascular reasons. And it's quite interesting. So this article came out in 1994. And even with these results, in the discussion, in the scientific discussion at the end of this paper, the focus was on the surprising lack of benefit rather than any possible harm that was going on. Although, to be fair, in that article, that second statement there did raise the possibility that these supplements may, or beta-carotene, retinol, may actually be harmful. But it took a second trial that was slightly behind that first ATBC one, more aptly named the CARROT trial, carotene and retinol efficacy trial, to come out for pennies to drop here, I think. So again, it's randomized and double-blind, similar sort of design in that respect. Different study populations, so men and women in this trial, and also former smokers as well as current smokers, and something to do with asbestos exposure as well. But again, a comparison between beta-carotene and the dummy placebo capsule. Same thing happened. That independent data monitoring committee stopped this trial early because it got similar results. So there was a nearly 30% increase in lung cancers in those participants from that trial who were using this mixed beta-carotene retinol formulation, and also an increase in mortality. And the thing that this trial did, that the first one didn't, the ATBC trial didn't do, was actually measure beta-carotene levels in the blood. And it's, not surprisingly, taking a dose of beta-carotene that's about 6 times the daily dose that most people would receive of beta-carotene. Those individuals taking the supplement had blood levels 12 times higher than they did at the start of the trial. So where did that leave the supplement prevention, chemo prevention field? Well, I think it sort of said that despite this huge wealth of observational data about the link between deficiency of a nutrient and cancer risk, when a high dose of that particular micronutrient was used, then something unpredictable happened. And not surprisingly, trial doses much, much higher than those available in the diet lead to high blood levels and potentially unintended consequences. The other key message from these trials, these beta-carotene trials, was that not everyone is the same. So the increased risk was restricted to current smokers. So it's saying something about the fact that the same supplement at the same dose can produce harm in some individuals, but not in others. And hey, the penny drop, isn't it best to actually understand about how something works in some detail before throwing several million pounds, US dollars as it turns out, at a clinical trial before you know anything about which particular cancer you might prevent with a supplement, how much is needed, who you're best giving it to, for how long and in what form. And I put this quotation down from a quite influential editorial in an American journal around that time in the mid-90s. I really like this. So it said, restoring levels of a given nutrient in populations at nutritional risk, i.e. deficiency, may be more effective than interventions in populations that are already nutritionally adequate and supplementing them to super adequacy. And I quite like that. So keep that one. with you when I say that, there's nothing new under the sun, is there? So, this idea that more is not necessarily better goes back to the 16th century, and this chap here, Paracelsus, said to be the father of toxicology, actually that phrase is attributed to him: the dose makes the poison. The idea that take too much of something and then it potentially becomes harmful. I think he made an example of water and oxygen. You can run into health problems drinking too much water. Similarly with oxygen. So even the safest life-giving things at the wrong dose can be poisonous. And I think that's the dietary supplement data on beta-carotene is an interesting example of that. And then that second quote there, I'm reappropriating what is said to be by Wikipedia another 16th century phrase, one man's meat is another man's poison, to really emphasize this idea that there are individual differences in response to the same supplement formulation and dose, which is a really good segue into the next example I want to use, and this is the trace element selenium. So selenium is really important for at least 25 enzymes in the body, important for the body making thyroid hormone, for immune function, etc. And I want to take you through this data because I think it's quite interesting in terms of insights into dosing and blood levels. So those data on the left-hand side are on the grey bars are the blood selenium levels in 14,000 American adults who were followed up in this big study for 18 years. And you'll see it peaks around a selenium concentration of about 120, 130. And overlaid on that is a red, this is the U-shaped curve bit. That red curve is actually the all-cause mortality. Above 1, that dotted line, means increased mortality compared with this population norm. And below that line means decreased mortality. So you can see that this is hinting that there might be a sweet spot in terms of selenium concentration that is associated with decreased mortality, and at either end, a high selenium level or a low selenium level might be harmful. So bear that in mind when I tell you about this SELECT prostate cancer trial. That was a trial of 35,000 men in the USA, Canada, and Puerto Rico. It was a trial that tested selenium, but also vitamin E. I won't talk about vitamin E today. But in the selenium side of the trial, overall, there was no difference in prostate cancer risk in those men who were taking selenium versus the placebo. But in the secondary analysis, the men who started off with a high selenium level actually ended up with double the risk of prostate cancer if they took the selenium supplement compared with the men who started off with low selenium levels. So that's sort of saying a similar sort of thing to that U-shaped curve there, that you could perhaps be pushed to the right-hand side of that curve. And it's really interesting when you actually look at selenium levels around the world, because the American soil has a lot of selenium in it, apparently, because levels in American individuals are really very much higher than those in other parts of the world, including Europe. So you can start to see that if you perhaps I would hypothesize that if you do a selenium trial, not in Canadian, US, or Puerto Rican men, but in another population of men, you might then start to push the selenium level up to that sweet spot around 130, 140, and potentially gain some benefit. And in fact, there's a not well heralded Chinese study of esophageal cancer from an area of selenium deficiency that did actually show benefit from selenium and other multivitamin supplementation for esophageal cancer risk. So the jury's still out on selenium as far as I'm concerned. Just like the beta-carotene story, huge amount of evidence saying if individuals have got a low selenium level, they have worse health outcomes. But no evidence in the trials that selenium supplementation reduced cancer risk. And in fact, a hint, a signal there that the selenium supplementation might be doing harm in some people. But is that because the trials were done in the wrong group of people who had high levels of selenium to start with, and not in those deficient people? And I can't find that anyone has done any form of personalized test and treat to a certain blood level type trial, either on an individual or population level. But just to say, moving on to the final example I'm going to use now, that there are other factors at play apart from the baseline, the starting blood level, for example. And that includes, maybe some cancers are more responsive to selenium and other multivitamins, other dietary supplements than others. There's some debate whether the type of selenium supplement that you use might play into different outcomes. And also, and this is the segue into the next section of the talk, whether genetic variation actually explains some difference in the response to supplementation. So I'm going to talk a little bit now, just towards the end, about some genetic insights that we're starting to get that might explain different responses to omega-3 fatty acids in certain individuals. Now, everyone's heard of the term omega-3s, I'm sure, beloved of the medical and popular press, primarily, I think, because it's easy to create a pun involving fish and fish oil, I think. But some of these headlines really raise other issues about omega-3s, and particularly the quality of some supplements in terms of whether the stuff that people are buying, being unregulated, is oxidized, contaminated, etc. We maybe pick up on that in discussion as well. So most people have heard of omega-3s. As I said at the start of the talk, I believe they're a class of substances that can be simultaneously thought of as nutrients, supplements, and medicines. And I ran through that contrast between dose and purity at the start of the talk, just to say that high purity, high dose supplements are available these days online, but still not to the same level that is available for licensed indication for prevention of heart disease, where the dose is up to 4 grams, 4,000 milligrams a day. And you'll see that in the trials I'm going to show you that I've been running over the past few years, I use the omega-3 EPA in that sort of dose range. Really, I apologize about this, really small little bit of biochemistry that I sort of need to talk you through. So omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids, ubiquitous lipids, fatty acids throughout the body, in every cell membrane of our bodies. And they have a huge number of important physiological functions throughout the whole of the human life course, from conception, birth onwards, including omega-6 fatty acids. But omega-6 fatty acids have now sort of got a bad label because modern human diets have a vast excess of omega-6 fatty acids in them compared with omega-3s. And in excess, omega-6 fatty acids get turned into this thing that I've called AA here. And AA is turned by this enzyme in the body called COX into lots of inflammatory and cancer-producing chemicals. It turns out that COX enzyme is actually the target for anti-inflammatory drugs like aspirin, ibuprofen, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Omega-3 fatty acids in modern human diets are a much smaller component, available in a short form in quite a few seed and nut oils and in plants. But our bodies, through this machinery called fads, are not very efficient at turning them into the omega-3s that you get in supplement and medicinal form called EPA and DHA. These are the things that are found in high quantities in particularly oily fish and algae. And the thing about EPA in particular, less so DHA, is that if you provide enough EPA, then it pushes the bad omega-6 AA out of the membrane and away from the COX enzyme, and it actually inhibits the COX enzyme in its own right. So think of EPA as anti-inflammatory, and as I'll go on to show, anti-cancer. So all of which makes it slightly surprising that when the studies have been done over the years, that there is not a very good link between fish intake and bowel cancer risk. And this complicated table here is the summary from the World Cancer Research Fund of different factors that decrease and increase bowel cancer risk with different levels of evidence. And you'll see that the fish is down in the limited suggestive area. I think primarily because the studies that have been done in the past have used, again, this is quite a common theme in my talk, isn't it? The wrong populations have been studied that often have low omega-3 intake to start off with. But also imagine collecting that sort of data from dietary recall questionnaires and the recall bias, poor memory that starts to make those data not particularly reliable, and the fact that none of these studies ever collected any data on whether people were using omega-3s in dietary supplement form. So all sorts of methodological problems. It's only in recent times when the technology's become good enough to measure omega-3 levels in the blood of several 100,000 people at a time that we've started to gain a little bit more clarity about the link between omega-3 blood levels and bowel cancer risk. These are our data from one of the jewels in the UK research crown, the UK Biobank. Huge study, 500,000 individuals, and who have now all got attached to them blood omega-3 levels, lots of other data, whole genome data as well, with omega-3 levels. And we've started to look at the relationship between the blood omega-3 level and bowel cancer risk. And what I want to point out in these two graphs here is that there's an inverse relationship between the blood omega-3 level, this here, or that one particular one that you can measure in the UK Biobank called DHA, and bowel cancer risk. So that line is decreasing down there, this thing called this hazard ratio here. Decreased bowel cancer risk with increasing concentration. But there's an inflection point here. I've put an arrow on the DHA graph. It levels off. There's a blood level above which you don't seemingly get any more benefit from taking any more. And this is really interesting because when we looked at it, that level of DHA there is the level that participants in the UK Biobank had if they were eating 2 or more portions of oily fish a week. And that sort of backs up the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition data, which is really old now, it's about 20 years old, which really recommends that we eat 2 portions of fish, 1 oily, per week. So this is sort of perhaps backing up the dietary recommendations for omega-3 in terms of bowel cancer risk. But I'm particularly interested in, as I said, the use of high-dose pharmaceutical-grade omega-3 fatty acids to reduce bowel cancer risk. And over the last 20 years, we started off by looking at EPA and DHA in the laboratory and showing that those agents could kill cancer cells in the laboratory, took it on to several other experiments that really confirmed what I showed you in that biochemistry slide, that EPA and DHA are anti-inflammatory and that they target the same bad omega-6 pathway that aspirin and ibuprofen, etc. do. So this really led us on to wanting to test EPA in humans. We really took the same line of inquiry and method that those investigators studying aspirin had done, really focusing on, well, something that Bob mentioned right at the start of the session here today, bowel polyps. This just expands on what Bob was effectively saying. The bowel polyps are the benign precursor lesion that we think are the origin of the majority of bowel cancers. Probably takes about 10 years, if you add up all of those years there, for a bowel cancer to develop. And it develops via small mushroom-like growths called polyps. And that polyp development probably takes one or two years. And the important thing for researchers like me is that we know for certain that the number and size of bowel polyps is a marker of future bowel cancer risk. So instead of doing trials where we've got to wait 20 years for several hundred people to get a bowel cancer, we can do much shorter trials measuring the number of polyps over a shorter period of time. So that's what we did. In fact, with this first trial with EPA, we looked at individuals with a rare genetic condition called familial adenomatous polyposis. These individuals invariably get bowel cancer as early as in their 20s and develop a large number of polyps in their colon and need surgery. So we did this trial because we didn't need many patients to prove or disprove the hypothesis that EPA would reduce polyp number and size. So 58 patients with familial adenomatous polyposis, FAP, 2,000 milligrams, 2 grams, high-dose EPA, and we measured polyp number and size. This is the one graph here that I usually show in talks. The bottom line is that those people that were randomly allocated, again, it was a double-blind placebo-controlled trial, those individuals who received the EPA had 20% fewer polyps than those individuals who were randomly allocated to placebo. So the first proof in humans that EPA might have polyp prevention activity, and by extension, colorectal cancer risk reduction. So that allowed us to then do a much bigger trial. This is the seafood trial set in the English bowel cancer screening program, where we studied just over 700 individuals who'd been detected as having multiple polyps after they'd had a bowel cancer screening program screening colonoscopy. So those polyps had been removed, and then they joined the trial, and then we followed them up for a year and then counted polyps at the end of the year. And we were studying the same dose of EPA that we had done in the FAP trial, and also aspirin as a comparator. And just note that bottom line there. This trial ended up studying 80% men, and those participants were 100% white British. Not my fault, the lack of diversity, just a consequence of individuals who end up having a screening colonoscopy and having lots of polyps in the bowel cancer screening program. Maybe talk about that later on. So what happened in this trial? EPA didn't reduce polyp risk. So here are the data. I show you them for EPA and aspirin. So that line along the bottom is something called the incidence rate ratio, the risk compared with placebo of having polyps at the end of the trial. To the left of the red line means that EPA or aspirin was beneficial. To the right means that it didn't have any effect. So when you actually look at that, there was only a 9% reduction in polyp number in people taking EPA compared with placebo. And that black line there crosses the red line, so it's not statistically significant. Aspirin, yes, significant 22% reduction, the sort of figure that everyone else got in polyp prevention trials. So we're scratching our head, well, you know, the FAP trial was positive, but seafood wasn't. And then this other trial came to our rescue. This is called the VITAL trial. This was an American primary prevention trial of over 20,000 individuals monitoring people for heart attacks and cancers who were taking a smaller dose of omega-3s, mixed EPA, DHA, and or vitamin D. And they showed this fascinating finding that although overall there was no effect of the omega-3 fatty acid intervention on heart attacks, strokes, and cancer, when they looked at the 20% of individuals who were African American in ancestry, then those individuals had a 75% reduction in heart attacks and a 40% reduction in a secondary study of polyps, which begs the question why. Lots of differences between the African American community and white European community in the States, as you can imagine. That includes lower fish intake and blood levels, loads of other dietary differences, lots of other socioeconomic inequalities that we can pick up on, but also genetic differences. And that really put us on to doing a secondary analysis of the seafood trial based on this particular gene variant. FADS, for those of you that were still awake during that biochemistry slide, is the cell machinery that really generates EPA and DHA, but also makes that bad omega-6 fatty acid called AA. And what was known is that those individuals who have the I version of this particular gene make lots more bad omega-6. And in fact, that's particularly bad news if in modern society we're eating a lot of omega-6 precursors. Back in the day, ancestrally, it was probably a good thing to be able to make omega-6s. And that's why this gene has probably been evolutionary selected for, in particular ancestries, including Africans and South Asians. So we wanted to test whether the presence of that I version of the gene would predict EPA response in the seafood trial. And interestingly, it did. So when we did that secondary genetic analysis, not everyone in the seafood trial had given DNA, and we couldn't test everyone. Then yes, when we relooked at it again, irrespective of that genetic test, EPA still didn't have any benefit. But in those people who had one or more copies of that I gene that I'm talking about, had a 50% reduction in polyp risk. So that opens up, I think, the exciting possibility that we can, if we understand more about the genetics of that FADS area in the genome, we might be able to predict on a personal but also a population community level, South Asians and people of African ancestry, those populations and individuals who might gain most from taking omega-3s. And I come back to this diversity issue. I mentioned that in seafood, 100% of mainly men in that trial were white British. That wasn't me trying to be the world's least diverse researcher. That was a consequence of the people who we could recruit through the screening program. And I predict that if we did a seafood trial in British South Asians or black British individuals of Caribbean descent, then the seafood trial might be positive, might give a different result. So that final description of how genetics might be interacting with a nutrient stroke dietary supplement. So my take-home message is And I'll leave these up. Maybe we leave these up while we're doing the Q&A, because it might act as a structure for some of the questions. I think I got over the message that the dietary supplement market is relatively unregulated, and that certainly causes problems in terms of people taking these agents. That there's no conclusive evidence at the moment that supplements reduce cancer risk, but there's stronger evidence that they might do harm. And I showed you beta-carotene as an example. So the guidance at the moment, I think, is absolutely correct. Dietary supplements are not advised for cancer prevention unless under medical supervision. And of course, you know, one of the things related to dietary supplement use is being pushed into a false sense of security, when in fact the focus should be on those other core prevention recommendations about healthy weights, balanced diet, etc. I argue that we still need better understanding of how these substances, these nutrients, vitamins, minerals, omega-3 fatty acids, etc., have anti-cancer activity. And perhaps even more importantly, why deficiency increases cancer risk. And that's needed so that we can start to think on a much more personal level about how we can use that blood level testing that I mentioned for selenium, the genetics, the omega-3 story that I told you, and identification of other high-risk groups that might help us use dietary supplements in an effective and safe way. So thank you for your attention, and looking forward to the Q&A.
Well, all I can say is I think that was an absolutely masterly account of this really difficult area, and there's no one better, I think, anywhere to talk on dietary supplements and cancer risk. So we're now going to open it up to you for questions. And those of you in the room who want to ask a question, please raise your hand. And online, you can type into the chat or comments section of your YouTube video, and the staff here will relay your comments. So while you're thinking of a question, I'll just, I think it's really interesting, isn't it, that you've, one of the problems with seafood, and it was great to see these seafood slides up, quite nostalgic for me.
Can I add that Bob was the chair of that oversight data monitoring committee for seafood?
Yeah, it was a wonderful experience, actually. It was such a well-run trial. But it is interesting because it underlines the danger of using screening populations for any sort of research. Yeah. Because people who accept an invitation to be screened are not necessarily typical of the whole population. So you're actually sort of selecting out a particularly healthy group, and maybe that's not what you're wanting. So
no, 100%. I mean,
yeah.
it was attractive for the people who funded the trial, because we set the trial inside the bowel cancer screening program. So to do it outside would have cost, I don't know how many more fold.
Yes.
In terms of funding. So you're sort of, for other reasons, you're sort of driven down that.
So just
down
to explain, if you've got a screening population, you've got a population who's at high risk of having the polyps, and therefore it's an easier population to study. But the problem is they're a highly selected group of people, and that's something that's actually quite hard to get across to the. So do we have questions in the room? Please, this lady here. There's a microphone coming your way. Yeah.
You're talking about balanced diet. I can see an easy answer. Community allotments, community food growing for the population to increase people's health. I think that would be great if it was linked into diet and supplements and everything.
Yeah. Can't disagree with that, absolutely.
Easy answer.
Yeah. There's someone at the back, and then this lady down here at the front.
Hi, thank you for a very interesting talk. So in the seafood trial, you showed aspirin had like a minus 22% influence, and the omegas had about 9%. Do you know what you have the recommendation here for balanced diet, physical activity? Do you know what those would have in terms of a preventative impact of those non-supplemental measures? If someone had more exercise in their diet, what would that impact be compared to these supplement measures?
So sorry, can you just repeat that? I didn't quite get that.
Is there some way we could categorize the physical activity, how much of an impact that would have compared to these?
Yeah, not my area of expertise, but what I will say from listening to many people talk about this in various scientific meetings is that it's rather difficult to quantify physical activity and actually provide a dose, in inverted commas, of physical activity. So I'm not sure of a particular amount of physical activity that's recommended.
Are there any experts?
Anyone help me?
Experts in the room that? And this lady here.
So are you saying in the UK the recommended amount of exercise?
Of exercise, yeah.
So 150 to 300 minutes of moderate exercise, 75 to 150 of more rigorous exercise, and then a step up from that is adding in weight resistance. That's a recommended in the NHS at the moment.
But not specifically related to cancer prevention.
No, but it's
that's
probably
related to non-communicable diseases across the board, presumably.
Yeah.
Is it lady in red here?
Can I ask my question whilst I've got the
Oh, I beg your
microphone?
pardon.
If that's
Yes,
okay,
of
if
course.
that's all right. So I'm going to come clean here. I'm a nutritional therapist. I'm functional medicine trained. I'm also a lecturer in biomedicine and nutrition. And a couple of things I'd like to pick up on is food quality. We keep seeing this phrase, balanced diet. To this lady's point, we're choked with our food chain. We don't have a chance of that, okay? To the point at the back about recommended exercise in trials like this, how do you control it? So nature never gives us one nutrient in our food. We would never give that amount of selenium as a supplement in practice. We would never give 50 milligrams of vitamin A or 25,000 IU vitamin A, etc. Nature doesn't provide it like that. Antioxidants work as a team, fatty acids work as a team, and that's where we need the food. So when it comes to supplements, there are people and companies who are trained in prescribing these safely. All nutritionist therapists that are registered with a professional body will also know how to prescribe or not prescribe supplements with active cancers as well as preventative. So although there are the really rubbish supplements out there are also some very intelligent supplements out there, and finding the right people to help you select them and manage them with you is really important. So I think some of your points are a bit harsh. Yeah, that's the only point I wanted to make. I think there should be a bit of a balance here.
I think to be fair, you're talking about cancer prevention specifically. So
Yeah,
I think that's.
sure.
Now, there's a lady in red over here that would like to ask a question or make a comment.
When you referred to the aspirin, you mentioned 300 milligrams. And it's my understanding from a CAP2 trial, I think it was, that it's 75 to 100 milligram is the recommended. Can you explain why the general recommendation here in Scotland anyway is as low as that when we've talked about the 300 maybe being, I don't know, of more benefit or not, or if I misunderstood that?
I'm just conscious I've got a couple of aspirin experts on the front row here. They're staring me down on this one. So the seafood trial was designed and started in 2010, 2011. Back then it was unclear, more unclear than it is now anyway, whether 300 milligrams of aspirin would be better than 75. I think some of the evidence, particularly from these guys down here, has really pushed the dial towards 75. That's in the context of what we call sporadic colorectal cancer, sporadic bowel cancer, the sort of bowel cancers that occur not with genetic syndromes like Lynch syndrome, which is the CAP2 study. Yeah.
My daughter here has been recommended that as a Lynch patient.
Yeah.
She was diagnosed 8 years ago, and I will say that the recommendation for the aspirin intake has only been in the past 3 months. And again, we wonder why that is. I know you can't answer that part of it, but...
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's been nice guidance about using aspirin in Lynch syndrome, but it's been a little bit unclear about exactly which is the best dose. Now, I've been on, I was talking about oversight committees. I was actually on the oversight committee for the CAP3 study, which is a comparison trying to decide whether 900, 600 or 300 milligrams of aspirin a day is better. It's not published yet, so I can't really talk about it. But yes, aspirin I think is really important for prevention, particularly in high-risk groups like Lynch.
Heather, yes, please. It's this lady at the front.
Thank you. That was fascinating. And I was particularly fascinated in your selenium differentiation between the American population and in the UK. I remember about 30 years ago, one of my biochemist colleagues talking about one of the side effects of being part of the EU at that time, because our wheat, instead of being UK, was coming from Eastern Europe, where they had a greater selenium deficiency in the soil compared even with UK wheat at that time. I wonder how the deficiency levels in populations have changed over time, or is the selenium example one of the few? And supplementary to that, can we do more in providing natural supplements to improve that deficiency where it exists because of your environmental placement?
Great points. I don't know the answer to your first question in terms of shifts over time. Maybe the data exists, I'm not quite sure. And your second point, I wholeheartedly agree, absolutely.
I was surprised he didn't talk a bit about vitamin D, given our interest.
And I knew you'd ask me that. I couldn't cover everything. So.
No, but in terms of prevention, it's actually, the jury remains out. But in terms of survival from cancer, once you have it, I mean, we as you know, have published a meta-analysis of all the available data, and there does seem to be a benefit. And one of the problems, and we had a bit of a discussion here before, is that a lot of the nutraceuticals or health supplements are actually multivitamins. And you're throwing in vitamin D, which in my opinion might, and certainly our data would support the idea that it might be beneficial, not in terms of prevention, but in terms of survival outcome. But you throw in vitamin A into that as well. And so you could actually have this compound increase and lowering of risk within a supplement. And I don't know what your views are on whether you should actually have single supplements in any given preparation, and whether the UK should actually be doing that. I mean, folic acid being another one that you alluded to at least.
Yeah, great points. Yeah, I apologise for not including vitamin D in the. I was looking at my watch thinking, I'm really pleased I didn't include vitamin D in that. And the other point to make is that I made a conscious decision to not do this, is talk about any data related to supplement use in cancer patients, people living with and beyond cancer. So that's a subject for another talk entirely, about the potential harms related, as well as benefits in terms of for vitamin D, of supplements like St. John's wort, for example, which is a classic example of how a supplement might interfere with how chemotherapy works and how safe chemotherapy is. So it's a different talk altogether, I think, about supplement use for prevention of cancer recurrence, as opposed to primary prevention, which has been the focus of my talk. And in terms of, I've been thinking about this, in terms of, the untangling multi-nutrient supplements and whether to use them individually, it always starts to get into the implementation and health economics science about whether you could possibly, personalize each of these individual interventions. So I think it's fast. I haven't got any answers. Personally, I think to make headway, we've got to separate them out and understand in a personalized precision way exactly what each one is doing. But whether there'll be a will to do that, I don't know.
I will follow up very briefly on that, if you don't mind. But exactly that point, which is that even in terms of vitamin D, which I come back to, but it's a good example of how, unfortunately, humans are not laboratory rats, and that they are actually free living, and you live in a particular area. And even across Scotland, there are actually huge declines in terms of the amount of UVB that's actually delivered to a given postcode. And then people move and the like, and people walk to work, and people do various other things. So they are actually very different. And controlling for all of that, in my opinion, is very difficult.
We're unique. We're unique.
You should be commended on actually delivering that trial, even though it was only 700 or so.
Thanks. Great talk, Mark. Brilliant. Now, I just didn't hear an awful lot about obesity in here. So, let's go back to the seafood trial. In your men, I would reckon, okay, they're not usual population, but some of them must have been obese. Were you able to control for obesity and impact?
You've not read the paper.
The details escape me.
Yeah. No, of course. It's not a surprise that in terms of BMI, I think 35% of participants had a BMI over 30, 80-odd% had a BMI over 25. Bowel cancer is an obesity-linked cancer, so multiple polyp formers coming through the screening program are likely to have excess body weight. So yes, they were, yeah.
So you might expect a different response from those who are in the very highest BMI category?
In terms of what? In terms of the omega-3 and aspirin intake? Yeah. Since seafood was published, there've been some data suggesting that aspirin dose should be modified based on BMI. That's a really interesting question about omega-3 dosing. I've never. Because we've got blood and mucosal levels of omega-3 fatty acids from the trial. I don't think I've ever looked to see whether a difference in BMI in the participants made a difference to the membrane levels that we were measuring. The more cells equals, more spread out. Yeah, I'll look at that. Yeah, thank you.
I think we've got an online question. Yes, can we have the online question?
How do you think the rise of online wellness culture has shaped public beliefs about supplements for cancer prevention?
personally, yes, I think that there's almost certainly more misinformation out there. I can't prove it. I sort of hinted at it during my talk that, those first few slides were based on data from YouGov polls and, which surveys, etc. There are no good data out there, and it gets even murkier when you try to understand where people are gaining their information from, and which influencers, etc., are out there. I mean, I don't know whether the nutrition lady on the third row would probably be able to have more insight into this question than I have.
I advise clients not to buy supplements if they're advertised on social media.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you. I just wanted to ask, I was interested in the beta carotene because we often, as researchers, talk about bedside and then back, and where they saw that there was clearly in humans an increased risk in lung cancer. Do you know if those sort of supra high doses went back to the lab? Because you could imagine there would be some interesting mechanistic insights in terms of accelerating carcinogenesis that may have helped. Because I think often research stops where we go, it doesn't work in humans, and it perhaps hasn't gone back.
Yeah. My reading of the literature was that there was a huge amount of debate about the reasons why beta carotene was harmful in high dose, and I think it's sort of the scientific arguments are sort of settled, but not convincingly proven that the beta carotene was high dose was so antioxidant that the killing effect of oxygen radicals on the cancer cells was wiped out, and that then allowed the escape of the cancer cells, but also some pretty complex sort of retinoid receptor biology underneath all of that sort of stuff. So I'm not sure I know enough about the subject to know whether it did sort of reverse translate. But I take your point that there are insights to be gained from doing that, absolutely.
Question over here at all? Oh, you've got another online question.
For people with a family history, what are the top 3 things they should focus on to reduce their own cancer risk?
Blimey, that's a broad one. In terms of, we're talking much more broadly than the sort of dietary supplement thing that I'm talking about now. It depends on the cancer. Of course, for a family history, if there's a known genetic condition, then that's the priority to get medical advice and understand exactly what risks are, because that genetic risk will almost certainly outweigh any of the risk from the other lifestyle factors. But clearly, if, for the sake of argument, breast cancer is part of a genetic condition that might be familial, and we know that certain breast cancers are associated with excess body weight, then that might be a prevention thing to take forward. I think the bottom line is, if anyone asked me that sort of question in their clinic, I would say, understand exactly what the family history is and try and understand what the risk is, whether there's a genetic, definitely a genetic predisposition to that or not, and then take it from there.
Is it back there?
Hello, thank you. My background is actually a physiotherapist. I was interested to know, or I am interested to know, if AI is, obviously a very hot topic, is playing any role in the work that you do. And as a total aside, or not exactly a total aside, there was an interesting interview this morning on Radio 4 about the role of AI assisting colorectal surgeons in the prognosis of polyps that they might find in surgery, and also in skin cancer?
AI in terms of colonoscopy and polyps, using clever machinery to help the colonoscopist find polyps that might otherwise be missed is already coming into clinical practice. In terms of diagnosis and determining which polyp type it is, rather than having to send it off to the laboratory and do expensive tests on exactly what type of polyp it is coming through. Personally, in my research, I wouldn't use sort of classic. I don't use machine learning AI at the present time, but of course many people are, and several people on the front row here will be doing so.
I think we've got time for one more question, if there's one more. I've got one online. Okay, so.
They're interested in the research that you're currently doing on the potential prebiotic nature of fish oil. Are there any early insights from that you can share with us?
Great question. Not time to talk about it, but like many researchers, we became interested in whether high-dose omega-3 supplements would change the gut microbiome, the bugs that naturally live in the gut. The idea being that many of those bugs metabolize dietary fibers, make these things called short-chain fatty acids, which then bolster the immune system and provide colon health in inverted commas. And what we showed in a trial was that people taking EPA and DHA in quite high dose again, like the sort of doses I was using in trials, do have more of those friendly bacteria in the gut that do make short-chain fatty acids than people who aren't taking them. So that sort of fits that hypothesis that EPA and DHA change the type and nature of the bugs that are in the colon, and that actually might explain some of the benefit of omega-3 fatty acids. And certainly there are other data, and I know there are some data out there for curcumin, that other antioxidant supplement that I mentioned in that picture quiz, that using curcumin does change the microbiome. And it's quite interesting that lots of those polyphenol botanicals don't get absorbed very well into the body. And there's always been this big question mark about how could curcumin possibly work and be anti-inflammatory when 99.9% of it doesn't get absorbed and just stays in the gut. And the hypothesis now is that it's because it's altering the microbiome and then it's having a secondary effect. So that's quite a long-winded answer to that question, but really interesting.
Well, I think sadly it's time to draw this event to a close. I did warn you about the questions, so. So to finish off, I'd like to ask one of our committee members, Farid Din, to give a vote of thanks. Farid.
Thanks, Bob, and thanks, Mark. Now, I made some little notes, which hopefully if I can read them, but I'll start just very briefly with an anecdote. You can see that I'm completely choked up, and over the last 24 hours, sort of was given some lemon and honey by my very caring husband. I didn't wonder about the science behind that. Took a couple of tablets of vitamin D. Again, I wondered about that. And then last night, tailed off with a fish supper. So I'm delighted to hear that oily fish was right up there. But on a serious note, supplementation for cancer prevention is one of those areas which is researched hugely on the internet, and you can see that people are looking for things to perhaps counteract some of the riskier things that we do. And I think on behalf of the Scottish Cancer Foundation, I really would like to thank you for beautifully constructed talk which navigated through some of the nonsense around supplementation and exposed some of the really good science behind thinking about nutraceuticals and supplementation. And in particular, Mark, as a gastroenterologist and an academic translational researcher, you've undertaken a huge amount of work trying to help us to understand what supplementation is required for cancer prevention. And I think widely you can see, thank you to everybody for brilliant questions which cover a range of areas which you've masterfully tried to negotiate. But this is a very hot topic. And in terms of everything that you've contributed, thank you very much for your expertise. Thank you very much.